development. Hello, ahead of the 2022 local elections, Reading today is interviewing all 4 party leaders. Now, this is an unusual election for Reading as all seats are being contested. This is due to the boundary changes, which has seen the number of seats increased from 46 to 48. We're focusing on 5 topics with about 5 minutes for each topic. At the end, party leaders will be able to make a direct address to you, the voter. While the candidates have been briefed on the subjects before the interview, they've not actually been given any of the questions in advance. In addition to this, Reading Today has prepared some ward pages on its website, giving you the chance to meet each candidate virtually and understand what they stand for. So with me now is Clarence Mitchell, who's leader of the Reading Conservative Group. Thanks for joining me for this interview.
Hello, Phil, and thank you for the opportunity.
Now, the first topic we're going to talk about today is development. And the first thing I just want to say, a lot of housing policy is being dictated by government. Now, the current government has set high housing targets for the South East. It's planning to reform the planning system. So how can a Conservative-run council influence Whitehall policy on Reading's need for housing?
Well, it's a very relevant question, Phil, and yes, you're absolutely right. Central government does oversee this. The government's targets are 300,000 new homes to be built across the country by the end of this parliament. That's ambitious. A number of councils are not quite reaching that yet. And we would do our utmost to make sure that our voice was heard by government. As a Conservative-led council, we would hopefully have a better chance of our views being considered fairly and being listened to. Traditionally, a Labour council tends to be somewhat, shall we say, antagonistic towards a Conservative government, and as a result, the collaborative discussions that should be taking place often don't really happen in as the effective way they should. So we would look to build as many affordable homes in Reading as possible. I appreciate that the current Labour administration are aiming to produce or build 300 council homes over the next 4 years. Personally, I think that's a little unambitious. We would hopefully increase that target should we win control in May. 300 over 4 years is only, 75 a year. Reading has fantastic potential. It certainly does need more affordable homes. It needs more family homes as well. That we agree entirely with Labour on that point. The question is where and how and with what level of community support that those homes are provided. This administration has been in charge for a very long time, and I'm afraid, without making this overtly party political, they are showing every sign of being somewhat complacent and frankly tired as an administration, and we feel that they could be more ambitious in terms of the provision of affordable homes that they are aiming for. On top of that, we would also listen to residents much more clearly. There are cases, not least the recent example of Reading Golf Club, the development that's proposed there, where residents' views, the vast majority of people in the ward, in the area, opposed that particular development, the sheer scale of it. And Labour agreed with them last year and rejected it unanimously, but this year turned on a sixpence and have now given it outline planning approval, making many people in Emagree, in Caversham and the areas north of the river absolutely despondent that their views are just not being listened to by this administration. We would make sure and would always prioritise that community support exists for housing. We're not saying we're against housing per se, of course we're not, but it has to have community support if it's to be a successful scheme that benefits not just those people who are able to live there, but the community that they'll be moving into. We will always prioritise a brownfield development where possible. I appreciate that that can be expensive with the remediation that's often necessary on such brownfield sites, but Reading has a lot of it. Witness the developments we're seeing in the centre of town all the time. Many of those are expensive flats, of course. We would want to see more affordable 3 and 4 bedroom homes within those brownfield sites than currently proposed to ensure that people can live in the centre of Reading properly. And we will always be against unsustainable development, not development per se, but unsustainable development. And that particular example I cited in in Emma Green is a case in point. We felt that that was an unsustainable scale of housing for that particular area and for the infrastructure that would be needed to support it. And as a result, I actually wrote to Michael Gove as the Levelling Up Secretary, asking the government to step in that case. He decided not to do that and allowed the decision to rest with the local authority. But it has, as I say, in that particular case, caused a lot of ill feeling. So we feel that the Labour administration should be listening to people far more when it comes to development of Reading.
That's a very thorough answer that you've given me there. But the manifesto that you published on your website doesn't mention housing at all. So why, when you've got this very stern, very strong views on housing, why have you not mentioned it in your manifesto?
Well, we talk about supporting development of brownfield sites, or rather prioritising that. And we say that we are against unsustainable development. And myself and all of our candidates are more than happy to discuss that in greater detail, as with any of the policy areas that we touch on in the manifesto. So it's not that we're not including it. It is simply one of many policies that we would want to bring to Reading to improve life for everybody here. We will always put Reading, its prosperity, its economy and its people first in everything we say and do. Reading is a great place to live, as witnessed by the Sunday Times recently, who said it's one of the top few in the country for the potential it has here, the great connections we have with London and the Southeast generally. But that's all very well. People need to be able to live here and to be able to afford to live here. So our manifesto concentrates more on aspects of the cost of living crisis, which we're also looking to address locally as well as nationally. I'm more than happy to discuss that in your next questions. But essentially, our top line, if you like, is that we will be against unsustainable development in areas of Reading where it simply can't, or where the infrastructure can't sustain it at the level that some developers would wish. And we would want to see more genuinely affordable homes being created. And again, in that one example, being the most recent one of Reading Golf Club, the number of affordable homes there is quite small compared to the overall market housing that would be provided on that site. And as a result, most of those will be, £500,000, £600,000 plus. And that's well outside the reach of an awful lot of people in Reading. There is still entrenched deprivation in our town in certain areas. And we are as acutely aware of that as Labour. Labour make great play about the need to end the injustice of deprivation and treat us as if we don't care. That's absolutely untrue. We do, and we would want to see the levelling up agenda that you hear so much about nationally coming into Reading to make sure that everybody in our town has the right to live and work and to enjoy life here and to the best of their ability, with us supporting them as the local authority as much as we can.
Thank you. Moving on to the topic of roads now. Your manifesto is headed in improving transport and infrastructure, but there doesn't actually seem to be any concrete vision set out in that manifesto. You talk about opposing congestion charge, you champion a third bridge across the Thames, you want to tackle potholes, but what's your vision for pedestrians, bus users and cyclists?
Our vision is for pedestrian, bus users and cyclists to continue enjoying their lifestyle and the way that they choose to get around, of course. We fully support active travel. We fully support more engagement, if you like, in exercise and providing greener ways of getting around. But we also support the car user, the poor car user. And for too long, most drivers, many of whom are working people that need to get about for their business with their, their commercial vehicles, not just their passenger cars. An awful lot of them tell us that they feel victimized by this council. They see cycle schemes, cycle lanes being brought in that frankly don't work in certain areas. And again, that's not saying that we're against cycle lanes, we're not. Where they work, they should be provided. But there have been examples, not least Sidmouth Street recently, where things haven't been working. On top of that, we think some basic planning that needs to be done better should go into the roadworks that are constantly seeming to afflict certain areas. Look at Caversham recently. We had City Fibre, again, doing important work. We need the broadband connections, we need the connectivity. So again, I'm not criticizing the contractors per se, but the work that was done recently led to huge tailbacks across both bridges, feeding right into the center and almost out towards the 329. And drivers were getting incredibly frustrated. It wasn't done at the right time of day. We would argue and we would plan, should we be in charge, to make sure that such important work is done, but on a realistic basis, i.e. Overnight, at quieter periods at weekends. And yes, we do very much champion the third bridge. I know that's been talked about for many years. It's a very difficult issue because, again, some of our neighbouring authorities have been against it in the past and probably still would be. But as a Conservative-led council, we would be in a much stronger position to negotiate with surrounding Conservative-led councils for them to understand the rationale behind it and how it would alleviate the congestion that, frankly, is endemic in Reading, always has been, and it needs to be rectified. So I'm not going to go into the granular detail of schemes now, but in essence, we want to see the driver, being able to cohabitate successfully with all of the other means of transport that we already have.
Okay, I just want to come back on it. The third bridge that's been mooted, it would actually be in Wokingham Borough Council land in Thames Valley Park, which is a Wokingham, it's a Conservative-run council. And if a Conservative-run council can't convince South Oxfordshire, when it is a Conservative-run council, obviously it's now a slightly different position, but what is the hope that a Conservative-run Reading council could make any difference here?
Well, until we get elected and take charge, it's difficult to say precisely, but rest assured, we would make the case very strongly for the need for this to be addressed. I mean, a third bridge, as I understand it, has been talked about for something like 100 years. So I'm not going to sit here and make wild promises that we can unlock this overnight. It can't. It's going to be a challenge. But there definitely needs to be another solution of that nature that alleviates the stress that we have in the centre of Reading. We have all of the east to west traffic on the A4 coming through. We have limited capacity on the bridges and a sensible, practical solution. And yes, it'll be expensive. I'm not sitting here making unfunded pledges, which Labour often accuse us in opposition of doing, saying it's easy for us to say we'll spend X and Y. We would have to look at the finances very closely, look at the practicalities of this, and discuss ways with government of getting support for it. But there is a greater chance, believe me, of a unified Conservative approach to this, unlocking it in time, than there is with the current impasse that we've seen for so many years with the Labour administration. And yes, some of our Conservative colleagues in South Oxfordshire and in Woking will have to be convinced of the merits of it. There's no doubt about that. But that's one challenge that I would relish if we were in that position of being able to move it forward.
Moving on now to the cost of living, which is a national issue, but the impact of this is very local. What is it that you think Reading Conservatives could bring to the table? What can they do to help people at this time of crisis?
Well, Labour are very keen to say that somehow we don't care and that somehow Conservative voters are wealthier than Labour voters, and it's all very one-sided. That is categorically not true. Believe you me, I'm not rich, and nor are many of my colleagues on the council. We are acutely aware of the cost of living crisis that's facing us all. It is not down to the Conservative government. The Labour literature that I've seen most recently calls it the Tory cost of living crisis, which is that's an appalling slur. It's just not true. In case they hadn't noticed, there's been a pandemic and there is now a war in Europe, which is causing oil prices to rise. The energy costs are a global matter affecting everybody, regardless of the party in power. And the government, and us locally, the government, though, is addressing this, a point I made in the budget speech recently. For instance, the national insurance threshold has been raised by the government recently, which will mean that some 30 million people across the country will be better off by around £330 a year. Everybody is going to get a £150 discount in the A to D bands for their council tax. And that will affect Reading people beneficially greater than many other areas because we have something like 60,000 people in Reading who live in A to D band houses. Labour are currently charging residents the highest poll tax, council tax in Berkshire. Why is that? When Conservative-run councils around the town are charging a lower council tax or lower increases, and yet providing even better services. A central plank of our manifesto is that we would always fight for a lower council tax here in Reading. People do not deserve to be charged as much as they are for the level of services that they receive. The Chancellor cut fuel duty by 5 pence a litre recently. That'll save most drivers probably around about £100 a year at the pumps. And we've raised the national living wage to £9.50 an hour. There's all the universal credit taper is also being cut. So there are lots of pieces to this complicated economic picture in play, but these are all points that we're making on the door, and that people should understand, and please understand, that we do see the pressures that everybody is facing. You only have to look at your latest gas or electricity bill. And I know that many people are very, very worried about how they're going to make ends meet. Now, you're right, it's a national picture and national government that dictates the broad thrust of that support. But locally, we will do all we can. And the one thing that would be within our power is to make sure that your council tax bills come down. And we would make sure that our rates here are lowered as quickly as possible should we become the administration.
One of the things the manifesto does say is no child should go hungry. What do you mean by that? How can you see that policy being acted out?
Well, again, it feeds into the cost of living situation, doesn't it? We don't want people having to worry about whether they put food on the table or whether they put the heating on. It's self-evident, normal human compassion. And we would make sure, again, through those economic levers that I've outlined, both nationally and locally, that people who have earned their money can have it available to spend on the basic necessities of life. And that, of course, is the central thrust of that, is that you're able to feed and care for your children. We don't like to see anybody feeling that they're compelled to use food banks any more than the next person. Food banks and the voluntary sector play a fantastic role in supporting those who have greatest need. And again, we would do what we can to support those, to make sure that where there are cases of fuel poverty, of food poverty within our town, frankly, it's scandalous that it still exists in 21st century Britain, let alone Reading. And we would do our utmost to make sure that not only do children have a good education at a local school of their choice where possible, but we would also make it come up with imaginative policies that would enable the basics of life to be met by every single resident in Reading. And we would make sure that there's much of the money that they've earned that they can spend on themselves and the family, rather than having to plough it back into a council that, as I say, we feel has become somewhat complacent and rather tired, having been in power for so long.
The next is the development finance. And you've already touched on one of the things that you do with reducing council tax. In 2020, 9 and 10 local authorities did not have enough money to cover their spending plans. Obviously, this is partly due to COVID, but it is a problem because the government support grant has changed in recent years. And obviously, Reading has been one of the councils that have been affected by this. So how could a Conservative-run council cope with the challenges that are going to be ahead?
Well, you're absolutely right. The government support grant has been reduced year on year on year, and that's a national problem for all local councils. And many of my Conservative group leaders and council leaders around Reading would agree that they're not happy with the government's position on that. Labour accuse us in the chamber in Reading of, somehow supporting this and being complicit in it. Of course, we're not happy with that either. But we also have to live within the real world. And the real world is that the government is making those cost cuts for efficiency reasons. And we would continue to argue for a greater share of the pie, if you like, for Reading. Our scale of our population justifies a larger grant funding. And that's a discussion that we would have to have with Mr. Gove or whoever succeeds him, should whoever is Secretary of State in coming years. But also we would argue locally that money can be spent better. The money that we do have can be spent better. Again, this year, for instance, the council has presented itself as running a balanced budget. Everything is wonderful. We're investing here, we're investing there. Well, the reality is the council was only able to balance its budget this year because of the COVID support grants that they received from central government. So on the one hand, we're attacked for cutting the monies, but on the other hand, it's gratefully received to balance the budget, but no credit is given. There've been a whole host of other government grants that have come in, which have enabled Reading to balance its budget this year, but they are still staring a £5.8 million deficit in the face in coming years. And there are an awful lot of assumptions being made about money that will be coming in from various sources in the budget. And that's why we didn't support it this year. Not because we don't want Reading to do well, but simply because we were being asked to support a budget based on an awful lot of guesswork and assumptions and repositioning of money in the system, if you like. Also, an example again, the council still has not got on top of its finances, its accounts every year. Any business, be it public sector or private, has to have properly audited accounts submitted on time every year. The council has failed on that for several years now. And that's not a criticism of the officers concerned. The officers and the new the relatively recent finance director are doing great work to get on top of this historic problem. And they are getting there slowly. There's a new finance system due to come in October. So I give them credit for that work. But nevertheless, the extra auditing fees that have had to be incurred to get to resolve that mess have amounted to nearly £2 million in themselves. Now that's your money and my money. It's not the council's money. And that's £2 million that could have gone towards keeping the council tax rise lower. So you know, Reading needs to manage its own finances better rather than simply pointing, oh, it's all central government's fault all the time. They need to look at themselves and understand that the monies they do have, whilst lower, I accept that, could be managed much better. There was one other example, human error perhaps, but one other example. We had a contract overpayment during COVID to a supplier of over £1 million. And the council wasn't even aware it had been made until the contractor pointed it out to the council. And it was then clawed back from them, thanks to their honesty. Now, okay, that could happen under any administration, I accept that. But nevertheless, the financial controls in place on Reading are not sufficiently robust. And we, if we were to take charge of the administration, would immediately implement a performance improvement plan for the whole council. The Audit and Governance Committee is responsible for looking at different areas to check that everything is being done properly, and that's only proper. But it tends to look at different areas like procurement or income and debt. We would bring in a performance improvement plan for the whole council, a complete root and branch review of what works and what isn't working, and where we can make efficient, effective savings, that where the money is then yielded, then go back towards helping everybody live a more productive and a better life as a resident of Reading.
On the accounts, which was something I'm going to mention in the council governance. Now, Reading's traditionally been a council with a strong Labour majority. Obviously, there was a time where there was no overall control, a decade or so ago. Do you feel that opposition views aren't listened to enough, or do you feel that the Labour-run administration has been ignoring you?
It's on a case-by-case basis. There are certain issues where we have had collaborative approaches. Bear in mind, I'm only a councillor for the last year. My predecessor, Councillor Skeets, will tell you that she has had a very good collaborative working relationship with Councillor Page and Councillor Brock as council leader. And where we agree on things, of course, it's for the good of Reading. This is not the Punch and Judy show of Westminster. It's about working together to achieve the best outcomes. So, for instance, we support the refurbishment of Reading Jail. That's a cross-party desire to see Reading Jail become a superb cultural hub, which it could become for the town, and an attraction of national significance. We completely support, with the Labour administration, the bid for Reading to become a city. It's long overdue. Many people think it is a city. Well, it needs to be made one, and hopefully Her Majesty will agree to that shortly. But on other cases, on individual cases, particularly around planning issues, I have to say it does feel as if we are ignored at times. Now, the brutal reality of politics is there are currently, and I'm speaking ahead of the election, obviously, there are currently 29 Labour councillors and only 9 of us. So we are outnumbered 3 to 1. And that is reflected on the committees as well. So as a result, our voice is not as strong as it could be. But if Labour choose to ignore it, they can. They simply can. They are a majority administration. And as I said at the start, there is a feeling at times on certain issues, and again, I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but on the golf course, it was the most vivid example recently. It feels that we are simply ignored and things can be steamrolled through when they choose to. And consequent to that, the degree of complacency can creep in. And I would say that for an administration of any colour, if you've been in power that long, it needs to be refreshed for the good of your electorate and for the good of the local democratic system. And as a result, hopefully we are offering that opportunity to people now, given this is the first all-out election for many years. And I hope many people can support us in that vision.
Well, let's imagine it is Friday, May the 6th, and Reading Conservatives have got a majority. They're in control of Reading Borough Council for the first time in over a decade. What would be your day one priority? What would be the first thing that you would do?
Well, the day one priority would be firstly to express our gratitude to the people of Reading for having the good sense to vote us in. And then I would want to sit down with all of my colleagues to decide who has the best strengths for which portfolio, who can lead on adult social care, who can lead on planning and housing, and all of the other policy areas that we would become responsible for. And I would sit down with the chief executive and the senior officers of the council to go through their priorities. I would want a complete snapshot of where the council is. And as I say, part of that would be a performance improvement plan to assess where things are working and where they're not working. And then we would focus on delivering the priorities that we've outlined in our manifesto. And that is essentially, in a nutshell, to protect our open spaces, our green spaces, from unsustainable development. We would make sure that every child matters, as you touched on in your previous answer. We want to see safer towns and safer streets as well. Knife crime, we haven't touched on that yet. That is still an issue. We saw the tragedy in Forbury Gardens and Bugs Bottom as well. And without commenting on the specifics of those, we have to make sure that street crime and knife crime is minimised. And we will work very closely with Matt Barber as the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley, again, a Conservative PCC. And again, we have very good links with him, and he will be able to liaise with us very closely on his initiatives. We would work very closely with Thames Valley Police. Very pleased to see the Chief Constable is making reducing crime his absolute priority recently. We also would want to see tougher action on drug dealers. County lines is a real issue. It's creeping in from London and the bigger cities. Reading is not immune from that. And the awful way that can impact on young people's lives is another dreadful factor of modern life. And I would want to make sure that is tackled. We're already working closely as councillors with the various community groups, the safer neighbourhood forums that exist, the Reading one and the North Thames North Reading Safer Neighbourhood Forum as well, which gives the community a real direct input into that debate around crime levels. We would also then look to our transport portfolio. Yes, we would look towards reinvigorating the third bridge debate. A lot of people may smile and think, well, good luck with that. But it's a challenge that we need to address. And I would also immediately begin discussions with our neighbouring councils to get them back to the table. Many of them may think it's a settled issue and they don't wish to discuss it further. Well, that would change if I was leader of the council. We would make sure that Reading would have a fair say in that debate and would urge action on that front. And we would continue to invest in leisure and sport. I'm very pleased to see that we do have 2 new pools coming, and the Labour administration is to be credited for that. But we need more central Reading facilities for sports than we have at present. And generally, I would want to see our infrastructure improved all around town. We haven't even touched on the IDR yet and the improvements around that. But there is an awful lot of work to be done. It won't happen overnight, but if the good people of Reading are generous enough to give us that opportunity, they can rest assured that we will not rest in making Reading an even better place to live for everyone.
The full part of the interview. We've got just a couple of minutes of time left now. What would you like to say directly to the voters of Reading?
Well, simply that Reading has had a Labour administration for too long, and I'm afraid the consequences of that are beginning to show. Decisions are taken without due regard to the community view or the view of the majority, particularly around some planning applications recently. Our congestion is endemic and needs to be tackled as a priority. The deprivation that sadly some parts of Reading, particularly south of the river and Wickley and areas like that, that exists, that is a shame, a blot on all our records, and we need to tackle that directly. Labour have been in charge for so long and say that they are great champions of ending deprivation. Well, if that's the case, why is Reading still, I think, roughly 141st out of the 300 and plus councils in the country for being the most socially deprived in the country? They will, of course, point to government cuts and say it's all the government's fault. That's not the case at all. They've been in charge long enough to have done something about that, and they haven't. So we would target that as an absolute priority area as well. And we would want to make everybody in Reading feel valued, feel a part of a collective community. It's a fantastic town and fantastic city to come, hopefully. And we want everybody to feel that they are invested in that they have agency in that, and that they have a council that is actually listening to them and will act on their concerns in as practical and cost-effective a way as possible, while keeping their bills down for their vital local services. You've been paying far too much for far too long, and you're not getting the services that you deserve for that money. And we would make sure that the council is managed much more effectively on every level to get to that stage, so that everybody can feel a part of Reading's improvement and Reading's prosperity to come.
Thank you so much for your time just now. Clarence Mitchell, the leader of Reading's Conservatives. This is part of Reading Today's election coverage. We're interviewing each of the 4 political leaders across Reading. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, we've got ward pages set up on the Reading Today website, rdg.today. You can go to your ward, you can meet all the candidates, find out what they stand for, and also where your polling stations are as well. Thank you for watching.